I thought the most repugnant argument for blue no matter who that I've ever come across was Sam Cedar, who basically said, I would vote for a candidate that was basically backing concentration camps. He literally said, I would vote for a candidate that was pushing for one concentration camp less. Basically, Cedar, who is Jewish, said he would vote for a candidate who backs concentration camps. I don't know of a more repugnant blue no matter who argument, and yet here we are. I found one that is even more repugnant than Cedar's argument. Cedar has said at one point that he'd vote for a Democrat if a can of soup, if it had a D on its name. That kind of gives you the perspective of where he's coming from. It doesn't necessarily matter who is running for Cedar. That person would get his vote, as long as it's not a Republican. I'm sorry, that's sad. That's sheepdogging on an epic level. And it misses the point that that's not a pragmatic choice at all. A more repugnant case of this blue no matter who argument that these guys tried out is Katha Pollitt. Now, Katha Pollitt is a columnist for The Nation, and she basically wrote a piece taking the piss out of Tara Reade's story. But she starts her piece off arguing, I would vote for Joe Biden if he was boiling babies and eating them. Think about that for a moment. Her argument is basically a man who is boiling babies and is eating those babies, and she is perfectly aware that that man is boiling children, human children, and eating those human children, whatever he's using as a garnish, I guess that's less relevant, but who's eating those children, and she would choose that person over Donald Trump. As far as I know, Donald Trump is not eating babies. As bad as he is, putting them in cages, deporting kids who haven't, not without notifying their parents, the environmental destruction, these things are absolutely horrendous. Even just basic and utter absolute incompetence in regards to how he was dealing with the COVID crisis and the number of people that died as a result. By the same token, let's just be very clear, this is not the same thing as boiling and eating kids. And to even start off with that particular postulation is, I'm sorry, problematic. And why I make this argument that blue, no matter who, is a failed strategy. This is an utterly unhinged and deranged article in the positioning and argument that she is making, and it expresses everything that I've ever said is wrong with this argument of blue, no matter who. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This video will be relatively quick, but I wanted to point this out to show how deranged people are that are backing the Democratic Party and backing Joe Biden, and what they're willing to accept if it means getting out Trump. When we say Trump derangement syndrome, I don't know anything else that makes that point that much more clear. I will back a candidate that is boiling and eating babies if it means getting Trump out of office. She says 4 more years of Trump will replace what remains. Keep in mind, all of this is postulated on a candidate that is boiling and eating children. 4 more years of Trump will replace what remains of our democracy with the unchecked rule of kleptocrats, fascists, religious fanatics, gun nuts, and know-nothings. The environment, education, public health, the rights of voters, workers, immigrations, people of color, and yes, women. Forget them. And not just the next 4 years. A Trump victory will lock down the courts for decades. I cannot believe that a rational person can grasp the disaster that is Donald Trump and withhold their support from Biden because of Tara Reade. It's called having standards. It's called integrity. It's called not necessarily looking at the political process as being relative, but acknowledging that you need standards in your own party to have any level of integrity in regards to what your party stands for. When they kept asking, what does the Democratic Party stand for during the time that Hillary Clinton was running or after Hillary Clinton failed that race, and nobody had an answer for it. Why? Because any notion of integrity of what that party stand for evaporated when any notion of accountability went up in smoke. Blue, no matter who. Doesn't matter what the person does. If they're building one concentration camp less than the Republicans, it's a pragmatic choice. If they're boiling and eating babies, doesn't matter. It's a pragmatic choice. If it's a ham sandwich and there's a D beside it, it's a pragmatic choice. I'm making a point that this cult of narrow focus myopic pragmatism, when looked at over the course of time, is not pragmatic at all. And yet, this is the argument that they continually make. It's a political scam to some degree. You have nowhere else to go. Shouldn't you care about who you are putting into that office? And if you have really gotten to the point where year after year after year after year, you're just saying, all right, I'll just back the guy because the guy's not a Republican. What does that mean for the person who you are backing, and what standard does that set going forward? I'm making the point that elections go beyond the individuals that win those elections. There are precedents that are set as you move forward in your political space. This narrow focus pragmatism, where they try to get you to focus very squarely on one specific individual race, misses the point that over the context of time, the political momentum has shifted decidedly to the left. To the right. We've moved faster and further to the right, whether you're talking about especially on issues of economics and especially on issues of war and peace. And these are things that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are basically marginally different on in regards to the way they engage. The catch here is for the left. People who vote on the left have forsaken their philosophical responsibility of trying to get policy that ameliorate the hard edges of our political system, be it economic or be it just human health. Because we've done that year after year after year, because you've had these people making this blue no matter who argument nonsense, basically you've allowed all accountability to drain out of your political process because you have no capacity to hold your political leaders accountable if you're just willing to accept any random Democrat. Doesn't matter what the person does. I can imagine Hillary Clinton going forward, cutting or privatizing Social Security, passing the Trans-Pacific Partnership despite her saying she's not going to do it. And people still saying, well, you got to back Hillary Clinton because Ted Cruz is a monster. Again, no political accountability. If you want to know why your political leaders are so weak and feckless that are in Congress now, look at the people who are pushing blue no matter who. If you want to know why Donald Trump is in office, look at the people who have pushed blue no matter who over the last 40, 50 years. You realize that when people get to the point where they believe that their engagement in the political process is not being remunerated in regards to material needs or their material needs, those people disengage. The majority of the people who are basically pulling out of the political process are making under 30,000 or are people of color. These are Democratic constituencies. Over the course of time, by you pushing blue no matter who, and by moving further and further to the right, you have basically discarded people who would have typically voted for you. I'm making the point that by not having actual, real, a policy agenda, not voting for somebody for the affirmative things that they're going to do in that office, you basically hurt the number of people who are in the political process, people who would have typically been on your side if you were willing to back actual policy and make an affirmative argument of who you are as opposed to who they are, not necessarily being an entirely relative factor. Is there anything of you that is something specific and objective and not entirely relative to who the Republican Party is? Because if the only thing that you have is a relative difference with the Republican Party, that means they can move further and further and further and further to the right, and you would just follow them right along with it, not having any integrity as what you are as a party, but only in this political game of we're least worse. Where's your standards? Where are your standards? What does it mean to have a standard where you would say, I'm willing to back a person who would eat babies if it means getting Trump out of office? I'm asking, where do you draw the line in regards to you saying, I'm done? Does that line just not exist? And if that line doesn't exist, you don't see anything problematic with that. You don't see anything problematic that there's no integrity. There's nothing of you that says, I can't go that far. If that person is backing concentration camps, I'm done. You don't get my support. If that person is eating babies, you don't get my support. I don't care if Satan himself is on the other side. There's something to be said about maintaining the integrity of your party from the standpoint of what it means in the terms of policy. Do you support this or do you support that? And having that not being entirely and always relative. You're hurting yourself in this argument. What you need to explain to me, what needs to be explained to me, fundamentally explained to me, is if Donald Trump is really the apocalypse, if Donald Trump is really so horrible and so bad, then you need to explain to me why it's not legitimate and why it's not just right to accept policy concessions in order to beat him. Meaning, if your objective is to unify your party, you can do it. The catch here is all of this consternation and hand-wringing has a lot to do with how do we unify the party without offering lefties anything in return to do so. That's the issue. That's the real question. My question is, if indeed Donald Trump is the apocalypse, if indeed women's rights, forget it, if indeed gun nuts, religious fanatics, fascists, kleptocrats, unchecked authority, the destruction of democracy itself, if indeed Donald Trump is going to do all of these things, then you need to justify and explain to me why it is not better to accept the policy concessions of Medicare for all and elimination of student debt in order to unify the party, as opposed to basically not doing those things and potentially losing to Trump. I'm making a point that if your candidate is not willing to accept policy concessions that have a chance of unifying the party, that is an issue for your candidate. And your question, or the question that you need to answer, that all of these people need to answer, is if indeed Donald Trump is the walking apocalypse, then why isn't Joe Biden willing to accept policy concessions in order to beat that walking apocalypse? That's the question you need to answer to me. And until you answer the question to me, shut the fuck up about the blue no matter who nonsense. You're shooting yourself in the foot with these policies. And fact of the matter is, the reason that you have Donald Trump right now is for that nonsense policy of blue no matter who, where your party became entirely relative to whatever the Republican Party was, allowing the Republican Party to move further and further to the right as the Democratic Party took all sorts of cash without any level of accountability to have a bar on the door in regards to that party just blazing to the right along with them. You have a problem with your democracy, and backing Joe Biden will not fix it. I would make the point to you that the pressure point needs to be on this notion of policy. Joe Biden either accepts those policies or Joe Biden needs to lose. This is not an issue for voters. This is an issue for your candidate. It is not their job to get your candidate in office. Like, share, subscribe.